policy of constructive engagement, as it was called 20-something years ago, the idea behind it was that if we engage with China economically and help make them rich, then that they would become more like us. They would somehow turn into a democracy, and they would have tremendous gratitude towards us, and we'd become friends. It's not the way it worked out. There were people who warned that this was a foolish approach. So most notably, the realist scholar John Mearsheimer at the University of Chicago warned back in 2002 that that was not the way this was going to play out. If we made China rich, they would seek to convert that wealth into political power, and then they would act the way that all other great powers have behaved throughout human history, which is they want to dominate their region, and they would seek to push the United States out of Asia. And the future that he predicted 20 years ago is the future that's come true. And I think all the constructive engagers, I think, have some egg on their face. Now, I understand where they're coming from. This is a fundamental difference between whether you see the world in economic terms, which is about creating positive sum games, basically trade, or whether you see the world fundamentally in geopolitical terms, which is about the balance of power, which is more of a zero-sum game. And I think that both views, they're both extremely important. We want to engage in positive sum relationships that generate more trade and more wealth for the United States. At the same time, we have to be aware and concerned about the balance of power. We do not want a number two country in the world who can rival the United States in terms of power, who basically could win a security competition with us. And we certainly don't want a country in the world to be more powerful than us. So I think this is sort of the yin and the yang, is geopolitics versus economics. And I think what's happened with China over the last several years is it's flipped. I think we used to see the relationship primarily in positive sum economic terms, and now we see it in geopolitical terms. And I think there's a lot of firms now in the United States who haven't embraced this new reality. And to go back to your question about, when should a venture capital firm take money from a foreign country and when it shouldn't, I think there's a very simple rule for this, which is if the country is a U.S. ally, I think it's fair game because the U.S. has said this is a partner of ours, so why can't you do business with them? But if the United States government has said this is an adversary, you're putting yourself in a really difficult, precarious spot by doing business with them.
Because then you have to explain yourself to the U.S. government, yeah.
This is the very simple rule we would use, is we would never consider taking money from Russia or
North
China.
Korea.
Any country that the U.S.
Iran.
government says is an adversary of ours. But if the U.S. government says this is a partner and an ally, then I think you can consider it.
Do you think there's a way, Sachs, to salvage the relationship with China and make it productive? Or do you think it's a far-gone conclusion at this point? Because one might argue, and I've heard people argue this, maybe China would have invaded Taiwan already if it wasn't for the interdependency. So I know we're dealing with, we're doing a lot of predictions here, but do you think it can be salvaged? And do you think it would have been a worse relationship if we hadn't had this interdependency that's been built up?
I'm not quite sure that the economic interdependence theory preventing war has been definitively proven. If you go back to World War I, for example, it was the case that Britain and Germany actually were each other's number one trading partners, and they still got in World War I for reasons that in hindsight seem really silly. So I'm not sure that economic interdependence can prevent, it certainly doesn't prevent security competitions from arising, and therefore I don't think it can necessarily prevent a war. Although, having business ties can lead to positive interactions.
Yes.
So I'm just saying the jury's still out on that theory.
Okay.
But I think that, like I said, I think once you're in a security competition, the way that we are with China, I think geopolitics rather than economics is in the driver's seat. And that's what's happening right now.